Well, good morning, world, and welcome to another episode of the Crisis Victory Show. My name is Dr. Hal Bradley, and my co host, Pete Turner, is also the host and director of the Break It Down Show. Good morning, Pete. Good to see you up there, buddy. Today, we have a very special guest. His name is David Kniess. He's going to be sharing a story with us all about his relationship to a Congressional Medal of Honor survivor. And Dave, I don't want to get too much into it because I want you to be the one to share the relationship. But I would like first and foremost to say thank you for your service. And I don't say that lightly. I understand the sacrifices many of us veterans have gone through and what entails in life after we come back out of the service and try to rebuild a life again for ourselves. So welcome to the show, Dave.
Thanks, Alan. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. This is really an amazing hour that we got ahead of us, and I'd like to break right into it. Dave, I'd like you to give a little bit of an outline of your military history, and then I'd like you to give information regarding your relationship to the Medal of Honor
Mhm.
survivors that we're going to be talking about today.
Yep. I spent some time in the Navy. I was a boatswain's mate. Got out in '94. Um, upon return, I went to college first. Uh, I think I was probably a junior, maybe only enough credits for a sophomore. But
Mhm.
a lot of my friends were heading off to Colorado to ski, and I knew I needed a kick in the ass. So, I went and talked to Marine Recruiter. They showed me the Rambo films, got me all excited. And as I was leaving, there's a senior chief next door standing outside smoking a cigarette. And he said, "Did he show you the films?" And I said, "Yeah." He's like, "Let me ask you something. You want to get stuck in a place like 29 Palms, or do you want to travel the world?" And I'm like,
Yeah.
"What do you mean?" He's like, "Come on inside." So he got me, I joined without a contract. I had no, guarantee of anything. And they put me in deck division. I was a boatswain's mate, which is basically, a grunt in the Navy. You're a
Yes.
helmsman, lookouts, you're standing watch at 2 a.m. in the North Atlantic. So, but it was a great wake up call, and it was the kick in the ass I needed, because when I got out and went back to school, I was like, wow, this is easy. I can't believe I didn't, apply myself. I had this great opportunity of an education, and I just kind of, but everything happens for a reason. So I
Yes.
finished. I finished in Connecticut, and went to school for film and TV. Got my first job at ESPN, migrated to Los Angeles and Fox Sports, which led to DirecTV Entertainment, doing a lot of producing and directing, like behind the scenes type stuff. We had scripted and unscripted shows. So I would go out and interview the actors and then put it all together. It was kind of like my training ground for, doing documentaries, because they're like little, 3-minute documentaries, behind the scenes look.
Yes.
So, but before that, I did a documentary, my first documentary ever, which was done on the cheap, super cheap. It was just me, one camera. And I had a teacher in high school and football coach, Dennis Mannion, who was a Marine who served on Hill 861 during the siege of Khe Sanh.
Yes.
So I called him one day because I was interested in writing a script about his experiences. And he said, "We're going there next year." And this is like '99 when I called him. I'm like, "What do you
Wow.
mean?" He's like, "We're going to Vietnam next year. We're going to hike up Hill 861. You want to come?"
Wow.
And I was like, "Yeah." So, and the weird thing was, when I was a senior in high school, he was an English teacher, but he would take 2 weeks out of the school year to talk about his experiences in Vietnam. And, he would have us read this book by, I think it was Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carried, about his experiences in Vietnam. And the book's all about the things that the GIs would carry with them. So I asked him a question. I said, "Mr. Manning, I read that a lot of veterans are going back to Vietnam." He's like, "Yeah, but you can't just go anywhere." He said, I would never go back unless I could stand on Hill 861 again at Khe Sanh. And
Wow.
13, 14 years later, the kid who asked that question was actually going to that place with him. So we hiked up to the top of Hill 861. The trench lines were still there, filled in with elephant grass. The ridge lines were just pot marked with, from the B-52 strikes and the Arty strikes, and, all the air ordnance that came down. Um, for people who don't know, Khe Sanh was a 5,000 Marines surrounded by, estimated 40,000 NBA, like
Yes.
hardcore. It was the first time the North Vietnamese used tanks in the war, Russian tanks. which, came into Long Bay, which was a special forces camp outside the base, and overran it. So, we hiked up there, and it was emotional. It was, it was like nothing I'd ever experienced. And that was my first window into the mind of a combat veteran, sitting with them late at night. And they really trusted me. And that's where I learned how to gain people's trust, because I really cared. I cared about the stories. I cared about their stuff. And these guys were telling me things they hadn't talked about in years, about what happened up there on the hill, and, the deaths and the destruction. And, so we spent our 2 weeks in Vietnam. We got arrested by the North Vietnamese, or not the North Viet, but the Vietnamese. We came down off the hill, and we came out of the jungle. It was a 5-mile hike. It was raining. It was muddy. There were leeches. And it was like we were on a patrol. It was crazy.
Yes.
So we come out of the jungle, and there's the Jeep with two, Vietnamese soldiers with AKs. And they're like, we walk over, and they're like, passport. They took our passports. You meet us tomorrow in Dong Ha at the police station. And we spent 2 days of questioning. They separated all of us in twos. And it basically came down to a shakedown. They wanted $20,000 from each of us, or we were going to go to prison. And Glenn Prentice.
That sounds like Mexico.
Yeah. So Glenn Prentice, who was the Marine that was with us, he's no longer with us. He passed away a few years ago. But we're sitting at this big table. We're on one side, the Vietnamese are on the other. It was like the Paris peace talks, right? And he's telling the translator, who's like an 18-year-old kid, he's like, you tell him right now, if he continues to hold us, I'm going to go next door to the hotel they had us in, and I'm going to call my congressman in California, who I know. He's going to call Washington. Washington's going to call Hanoi, the U.S. Embassy in Hanoi, and the Vietnamese officials in Hanoi are going to call him. Now, how does that look when just 3 days ago, my president signed a trade agreement with your country? And the kid's like, I can't tell him that. He's like, you tell him every word. And he told him, and the guy slammed his fist on the table and said something in Vietnamese, and they all got up and left the room for an hour. They were like saving face or something. Then they came back and said, okay, $40 each, and you're free to go. So we're like, okay.
Funny how that happens.
Back then, that's a month's salary in Vietnam,
Hey, Dave, I'd like to interject at this point just for a moment. This is really going to shock you. My older brother, John Bradley, was a Purple Heart recipient in the Battle of Khe Sanh.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So you bringing up this really sends chills down my spine. I remember going to the Bremerton Naval Hospital when John was medevac stateside, and I walked on that ward, and I'm 16 years old, and I'm looking at my brother wounded in action. I look at the whole ward. All of these guys had just come out of there, and it made me so angry that I went down, got my GED, and 7 months later, I joined the United States Army. I was infantry airborne. I was a paratrooper, and I went overseas to Germany and did my tour there. But nonetheless, Khe Sanh, of all things that you would bring up today, and where that reflection brought me back to. So thank you for sharing that. He wrote a book about it. He's got a book out there. So
was he there during the siege, or was he during the hill fights?
Yeah, he was there. He was there.
Okay.
He was wounded in action. He was shot. And pretty amazing. John never talks about it. He's a man of very few words, but he ended up getting patched up and spent 23 years in the United States Marine Corps when he retired.
Wow.
I also have a nephew that retired out as a sergeant. He was, I believe, in for 6 years. I could be wrong, but so I have 2 Marines in the family, and we also have some Navy veterans in the family that were in prior wars. So nothing but respect, brother, and thank you for letting me add that. So this is kind of personal to me, and
it was a hellacious battle for sure. The interesting thing about that, after that trip, over the years, I've become friends with a lot of journalists who worked in Vietnam. Tim Page, Catherine Leroy, Nick Ute, who's still here. Wow. He's in LA. He took that famous picture of the girl who had her clothes all burned off on the highway there running.
Wow,
naked.
Amazing! I know the picture.
Yeah, Nick's a great guy. But I met Catherine, and I went and we became friends, and we went and saw the remake of Graham Greene's The Quiet American, and we're
Yes.
sitting in the
Yes.
theater and she's pointing, and it was like they shot that in Vietnam. So she's pointing out all the streets and say, we used to hang out there. We used to for me, people get excited about celebrities, but I was like, this woman's a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer and I can't
Yes.
believe I'm hanging
Yes.
out with her. Right. So she came to my house for a cookout one day and Glenn drove up from San Diego and I wanted them to meet and they sat down and it was like they were all veterans because, people don't realize photographers and journalists experience the same trauma,
Of
they
course. Of
just, it's
course.
not really talked about. So it was like they were old friends, reliving these battles. And she's 4'11. She was 4'11 and she was in the thick of it with the Marines. She was there during
Yeah.
the hill fights. She took these amazing pictures. And Glenn pulled out a picture and he gave it to her. He's like, I want to give this to you. I took a picture of you in '68 when you were on the front
Wow.
lines.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was amazing to see her. She's 25 years old,
Yeah.
but that's a little side story. She passed away years ago, probably, God, it's got to be 20 years now.
I'm
Um,
sorry to hear that. I really
yeah.
am.
Yeah.
What history she was a part of. And that my brother was there in Quezon in '68, going through the
Yeah.
hell that she witnessed. Pretty
Yep.
amazing.
Yep. Yep. So yeah, that was kind of my introduction into learning about combat veterans and what they've experienced. And it was kind of like a warm up to what I would experience, a few years later with
Yes.
the guys from 3-7 coming back from Iraq. And um, I guess I should start in 2003 with I was on a flight, LA to, I was going to Hartford, but the layover I think was in Detroit. I don't even remember. It's been so long, but I got on the plane, I sat down, and this kid comes down the aisle, high and tight. I knew he was a Marine. Sat down
Yes.
next to me, and we buckle up, we get ready for the ride, and I asked him, I said, "You Marine?" He's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Where are you stationed?" He's like, 2-9, 29 Palms.
Yeah.
And we spent the whole night just talking, you know. And he was just one of these people that you meet, and it's only happened to me a couple times in my life where you just meet someone, whether you're at a cookout or on a train, wherever you are, and you just know there's something special about this person, right? And he just
Yes.
had that charisma and that big smile on his face, and he was a grunt. He was with 3-7. He was a machine gunner. He was a squad leader. He was a corporal, and I'm like, he's going to go to war. And he said they were deploying in after the holidays. That's why he was going to see his folks. So we have our layover, and it's 4 in the morning, and I shook his hand. I said, "Hey man, take care of yourself over there." And he just kind of smiled. He's like, "No worries, man. Like everything's cool." And I
That's a
just watched him.
Marine.
Yeah, and I just watched him walk down the aisle, and I thought to myself, "Man, what a great kid." You know.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
months later, it was probably May when this happened. I'm working at Fox Sports, and in our edit rooms, we've got the TV and we've got the news on all the time, and I'm always watching. What's going on in Iraq because we had just invaded Iraq the year before. And one of my friends said, "Hey, man, you're a vet, right?" I said, "Yeah, I was in the Navy, whatever, blah, blah, blah." And he said, "Have you seen that website, iCasualties.org?" And I'm like, "What's that?" And he's like, "They list all the people, all the KIAs in
Yeah.
Afghanistan and Iraq." I'm like, "Oh, really?" So I went home that night and I started looking through the website, and, I hit the little search window and or no, I didn't hit the search window. I did that later. I started going down the list, and it was 2004. It was like the height of the insurgency. There was a lot of kids getting killed,
Yeah.
and most of them were Marines, and I'm just going down the line, and all of a sudden I see this kid. I couldn't remember his last name. I just saw Jason Dunham, 29 Palms, Corporal,
Yeah.
United States Marine Corps, some little town in upstate New York. And I'm like, and I went right to Google and I typed in his name, and his
Yeah.
picture came up.
Oh my
And I'm
God.
like, oh my God, not
Yeah.
that kid, you know? And it really hit me like a ton of bricks. I was just like, why does a kid like that get killed? He's just, and I had no idea what he'd done at that point. So I sat down and wrote about it, and I shared it with my Kson friends. They have a website, and they had a message board back then that was really active. Guys were always telling stories about Quezon during the siege. So I posted that story on there. I met this Marine and I just found out he was killed or had died. And somehow that story ended up in his hometown paper.
Yeah.
And, weeks later, I get a phone call and I don't recognize the number. So I let it go to voicemail. And then I listened to the voicemail and it was Deb Dunham. She said, I read your
Wow.
story and I wanted to talk to you about my son. And I'm like, I was scared. I was like,
Yeah.
and why am I scared? I'm just like, what am I going to say to her? You know?
Yeah.
So I didn't call her. And then 2 weeks later, I got another phone call and I didn't answer it. I knew who it was this time and I didn't answer. I sat there on the couch for at least a half hour and I'm like,
Wow.
you got to call this woman. So I picked up the phone and I called her and she answered. I said, Deb Dunham, this is David Kniess. I said, I've wanted to call you. I just don't know what to say.
Yeah.
Sorry seems like too little too late. I said,
Yeah.
she's like, I want to talk to people who met my son. And I got kind of choked up. Like, I could
What
just,
a
I
moment.
had kid. Yeah, I had kids. And I'm like, I can't imagine, you lose your child. So we were on the phone for at least an hour, 2 hours with her and her husband. And, I just told her about the plane ride and how much I enjoyed talking to her son. And he seemed like a really great kid. And she said, well, why don't you come visit us over the 4th of July weekend? There's this big balloon rally that we have here in town, in the next town, Wellsville. And they're going to honor Jason at it. And I'm like, yeah, I would love to come up. So I flew up there with Glenn Prentice, Marine from Quezon. And then I had 2 other Marines from New York, also Quezon guys, drive up because Scio, New York is like on the Pennsylvania border out near Buffalo.
Uh-huh.
So these guys came up and, we spent the whole weekend there. I remember going to the door and, she opened the door and she just hugged me. And I mean, it was emotional.
Yeah.
And she
There are
said,
no
where's your
words.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
and it really made me understand more what the guys from Quezon would tell me about losing someone, you know,
Yes.
because now I had met someone that I really thought was a stellar person, and all of a sudden he's gone. So I kind of had an inkling of what that felt like. So she looked at me and said, "Well, where's your bags?" And I said, "Oh, I checked into that little hotel in town." She's like, "Dan, go get his bags." She said, "You're staying with us."
Wow.
And that was the beginning. I spent that whole weekend with them, and I went up to the cemetery in town, and we're talking a town of 1,200, one stoplight.
Right. Yeah.
Everybody knew what had happened to him. So I went up there by myself one day and spent some time, and I just kind of talked to him, and told him that I was sorry about what happened to him, and you know how I thought he was such a good person, and I'm sorry this happened to you. It was emotional, man. So, spending time with his parents made me realize why he was the way he was, the kind of person and everybody I talked to from that point forward who knew him were saying the same things I was saying, so I
Yes.
knew. I'm like, it's not all BS. This kid was like
Yeah.
the shit, right? He was a leader, he was a leader of Marines who he wasn't, an NCO like a lot of NCOs. You make corporal, and all of a sudden you guys get over there and fill the sandbags. I'll be over here having a cigarette.
Right.
It was, hey guys, we got to fill sandbags, and they all knew that Jason would be right there with them, and
Yeah.
they've told me this.
He was a hands-on guy.
He
Yeah.
was,
Yeah.
and he was firm. One guy, this kid Muck, this Marine from Alaska, told me. He said, he was a good guy, but he knew when to lay the hammer down. You know,
Yeah.
it was all fun and games, but when it was work, it was work. And he was very serious about training these guys because he didn't want any of them to get killed. And he told Mark Dean that, weeks before they left in a hotel room in Vegas. He said, because Jason was about to get out. He was a security forces Marine, right?
Yeah.
He was stationed in Georgia. Then they shipped him out to Pendleton and stuck him in 3-4. And then they had all these corporals from security forces in 3-4. So they started spreading them out, and they sent Jason to 3-7 with a few other security force guys. And, so a lot of those Marines were like, they had one tour under their belt. They've been in combat. They're like, who's this corporal coming in with no experience? They used to razz him a little
Yeah.
bit. But he was due to get out. And he didn't have to go the full tour in Iraq, and they probably would have just not taken him, but they made him a squad leader. So he took that serious and he started training these guys, the work up to the deployment. So he told Mark one night, he said, hey, I extended. And Mark's like, what? He's like, yeah, I extended, man. I'm going to Iraq with you guys. He's like, why the hell did you do that, man? You can go home. He's like, no, I'm not letting you guys go over there by yourselves. He's, I trained you. I want all of you to come home to your families. And
Yes.
that's why I'm going. And when he said that, that was just another example of who he was and how much respect these Marines had for him. So, they shipped out, went to Iraq, and the day this happened, and you saw it in the film, the night before it was, this was going to be his first solo, patrol that he was in charge of. Lieutenant Lieutenant Bull Robinson was not going out on it, and that was the platoon commander. He was on a night op the night before, so they let him sleep there in the morning. So it was just Jason, right, and the squad. So they got he was up till 2 a.m. As you see in the film,
Yes.
preparing his patrol order. And Trent Gibson, who was a captain at the time, the company commander, was in there watching him. And he's told me this. He said, I was sitting there watching him, and I thought to myself, and then I watched two Marines bring him food.
Yeah, I saw that in the
And
film. That was amazing.
oh,
The
such an amazing
the
moment
honor,
when he
the
told me this.
honor.
Right. He said, they told us stories about that. You'll know a true leader when you see his Marines taking care of him. And there it
Yes.
was. These two Marines came in with a plate of chow at 2 a.m. because Jason had been working so hard. He didn't have time to eat. So they all came in and took care of him.
Yeah.
He said, it was as if they were crowning him as their leader. And when he said
Yes.
that, I was just like, I mean, that's emotional stuff, right? And, and Jason was a big guy, 6'2", 200 pounds, ripped. And Trent said, I'm sitting there watching him work on his orders, got no shirt on, Marine Corps tattoo on his chest. And he said, I thought about taking a picture of him, but I didn't do it because I was too fucking lazy that night.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
he's like, and I beat myself up every day for not taking it because it would have been the last picture of him. And he said, I thought to myself, what would I ever do if I lost a Marine like that?
Yeah.
And next morning they mount up, head out to the police station. A little background about Husayba and Al Qaim, that whole area. It was right on the Syrian border, and this is where all these insurgents were coming through, filtering in to hit Fallujah and Ramadi. That was the first stop, Husayba.
Mhm.
So they were, raising a lot of hell in that area. So, 3-7 was tasked with rooting out these insurgents coming through or stopping them on the border. And they were also doing reconstruction. They built a new police station. They had all these police that they were training. So this patrol was basically, security patrol outside the police station while the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Lopez, was visiting the police station to check everything out, make sure everything's going okay. So Jason's guys were outside providing security, and they wrapped it up. Colonel left, and Jason and Trent, a few other Marines, went next door. There was an abandoned water treatment building. So they went up to the rooftop. They were looking for a firm, place where they could run ops out of.
Yeah.
So while they were up there, they hear explosions. And then Jason comes running up the stairs and says to Trent, or Trent says, what do you think? He's like, I think Lima's getting hit. And it wasn't Lima. It was actually the battalion commander. He was heading back. They had a base, a small base on the edge of town at this train station, abandoned train station. So on their way back, the colonel's convoy got ambushed, RPGs, small arms fire, rockets. So, Jason ran up there and told Trent, he said, I think Lima's getting hit. And Trent's like, well, let's go get those motherfuckers, So they mount up and they start racing towards the colonel, and then they get lit up RPG comes right across the front vehicle. They immediately stop, dismount, and they're in a section of town where there's kind of an artery, and there's only one way in and out of this area. So whoever did that ambush is going to be coming through there. So right away they set up, hasty vehicle searches. And Staff Sergeant Ferguson was standing there giving Jason some orders, this is what I want you to do. And Ferg said the whole time I was telling, he was listening, but his eyes were glued on this white SUV up the street. And as soon as I told him to go, he went right to that vehicle with two other Marines. And two guys had hopped out of the back of that vehicle right before that and had run, but the driver was still sitting in there. And basically, Jason walked up to the vehicle. Kelly Miller went around the passenger side. And as Kelly got to the back door, he looked in the window and saw the RPGs in there and AKs. And as he went to turn to tell Jason, who had told the guy to get out, the guy had hopped out and tried to choke Jason. And Jason took him to the ground and just started wailing on him. Miller came around, extends an asp, puts a knee into the guy's chest, and cracks him in the head 3 times. And this guy's still fighting. Meanwhile, Billy Hampton, who was checking the vehicle in front of them, comes running up. And he's standing over both of them, questioning whether he should try and, muzzle thump him and shoot him in the head. But he didn't want anybody to get hurt, so he didn't. And this all happened split seconds. Jason had the guy's arm down on one side, and the last thing he said was, no, watch his hands. And the guy had a grenade, and he just let go of it. And Jason instinctively took his Kevlar off, slammed it down on it, and just laid on it. And boom.
My God.
Yeah. And Kelly and Billy got blown off to the side of the road. And Kelly still remembers. He said he describes it as watching a slideshow where he just sees Jason's body go up and then come back down. And he said it's not continuous motion. It's like slides, and it's probably because his brain's rattled from the explosion, right?
Of course.
So he's laying there lifeless. And the strange thing about this, just 2 weeks before that, Jason was in the train station in their squad bay type of thing, and he was talking to Bull Robinson, second lieutenant, who was their platoon commander, and they were talking about grenades. What would you do if you were faced with a live grenade? And Jason's like, well, I think if you took your Kevlar off and put it over it and laid on it, you would deflect some of the blasts. And Robinson's like, no, man, that would mess you up, He's like, yeah, but I think, with the Kevlar vest and the helmet, you could. He's like, yeah, but you'd still get screwed up. Yeah. So he said, plus you wouldn't have time. He's like, I could do it. And he said, all right, go get your gear. So he went and got his Kevlar on and his helmet. And he said, okay, time me, And Robinson said he didn't even get through 1/1000, and he had the chin strap loose, so he just ducked his head down and caught the Kevlar in midair and slammed it on the deck in less than a second. So when it happened, when it happened, right? And when it happened, they all knew. They were like, "Oh my God, he was, he was practicing this. He knew instinctively what he would do." And for a lot of people who never served in the military, for someone to sacrifice himself like that, I mean, that's love.
Absolutely,
that's brotherhood. And
Dave, I got to tell you, when I was watching The Gift on more than one occasion, I literally had to stop and I wept. I wept. The camaraderie that was between those men, such courageous men, and the love and the respect that they carried for him was just beyond words.
Yeah.
Like I said to you earlier, and for you to be a part of all of that, it's absolutely miraculous and wonderful that you're able to document such history and share it on this show today. Because as you speak about this, my eyes were closing behind my glasses and I was actually living the moment. And you were so descriptive and so defined. And I mean, the absolute love that they showed this man, like you said, bringing him food because he wouldn't break away from preparing for his men, the dedication that he had to their lives, to their salvation coming through, and absolutely phenomenal. But there's a motto that's out there that says, once a Marine, always a Marine. And the Marines really take that to heart. And I know this from having an older brother who was at Kniess, Purple Heart recipient as a result of that battle. And I just know that the love never leaves any of them. They stay as a family. So kudos to you for sharing and documenting that. And Go ahead and please finish. I just wanted to interject at that point.
Yeah. So no, thank you. That was, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yes.
A lot of whether you're Navy, Army, unless you know a lot of Marines, you don't really understand it. I don't fully understand it because I was never a Marine, but I'm envious of that.
Yes, me
There's something
too.
very special about Marines and their brotherhood. That's like no other branch of the service. You
I
know,
never
um,
realized until I watched The Gift. I never realized, and I have two Marines in my family. And
yeah,
when I saw that and I saw such dedication, I was a paratrooper. I was involved from 71 to 74, served overseas, and we had a camaraderie of ourselves. We were proud that we had silver wings on our chest, but it doesn't measure up to what I saw in The Gift. That was
right.
absolutely breathtaking. So
Oh,
please
thank you.
continue. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So the sad thing about this story is they broke up the squad. Before they started doing these vehicle searches because half of Jason's guys went down a different street. So there's two streets heading this way, right? Jason
Yes,
took a bunch of Marines this way. The other, I think it was, I can't remember who it was, Lance Corporal, took the other Marines that way, and they were going to link up at the end, right?
yes,
That other group of Marines, till this day, still beat themselves up because they weren't there. You know, um, one of them in particular, he said I was his point man. He didn't have to do that. That should have been me. You know,
yes,
if we hadn't broken up that squad and I hadn't had to stay back with the gun truck, I would have been there. Maybe things would have been different.
yes,
And I've had these late night conversations with these guys many times over the years. But that's the sad part of it. Jason was still alive. So, but when that squad came up, they came up and saw him, and
yes.
Mark Dean, who was really close with him, didn't even know who the Marine was because he was
Wow,
so messed up.
wow.
And he said, I remember just looking down and said, man, that Marine's fucked up, you know?
Yeah,
And then they ripped his shirt off. The corpsman took cut his shirt off and he saw the tattoo and it just broke him. He knew
yes,
it was
of
Jason.
course.
So they load him in the Humvee and took him to the medevac, and they, medevaced him out to Al Assad, and that's where Heidi Kraft's story comes in. She was a lieutenant commander, psychologist who worked in the medical unit there, and
Yes,
the choppers would always come in with the wounded, and they'd be out there triaging. Send that one to the expectant ward, bring him in right away. We're going to operate now. And they saw Jason and said, put him in the expectant ward because they were like, he's not going to make it, with that
yes,
head injury he has. So Heidi would go in there and sit with these Marines, and they're unconscious. It's basically a room where they're just keeping them comfortable, waiting for them to die. And
right.
she sat there and held his hand and talked to him, and he squeezed her hand. And she didn't really think anything of it at first. She said, well, he's got a head injury, it's reflexes or whatever. And she said, then he squeezed it again.
Yes,
And then I started to kind of perk up. So I leaned down in his ear and I said, Corporal Dunham, if you can hear me, I want you to squeeze my hand now. And he grabbed her hand and pulled her whole body down to his chest. And she ran and got the doctors, and they urgent medevac. They got him out of there and got him all the way to Germany,
yeah,
where he was on a ventilator, I think, at that time. I'm not positive, but Miller and Hampton also got medevac to Germany. They were banged up pretty bad. And Billy actually got to go up and see him. And
wow.
it really broke him to see Jason like that. He said, to see this warrior who was just leading me into battle on life support, it just killed me. Same thing with this other guy, Adam Walker, who has the famous quote, all that we have has been given to us. What we
Yes,
do with what has been given is how we honor those who gave.
yes,
He got hit the next day, and that was kind of the kickoff of the Battle of Huseva. And so he was in Germany, and he went up there too and saw Jason. And he talked about it. I did an interview 20 years ago. He was back at 29, healing up, and he ended up returning to the unit. He wanted to go back, but he told me about how he saw Jason up there, and it just broke him to see him like that. But from that point, they got Jason on a flight to Bethesda, and Billy Hampton remembers it because the nurse told him as they loaded him into the plane, He said, your squad leader's going with you. He's in the back. And
Wow.
that was the last time Billy ever saw Jason. Was actually in the hospital, but he knew that Jason was on the same plane, but he never saw him again after that. So they got him to Bethesda, and Deb and Dan by this time were told what happened, and so they met. They met down at Bethesda, met with the doctors the first day they got there, and it even till this day when I hear Dan talk about it or when I watch it, it kind of affects me because Dan basically told Dan and Deb, these are the injuries and it's not good and you need to make a decision. And
Yes.
Dan looked at the surgeon, who was a woman, and she said, do you have kids? And they both said yes. Or no, they both started to cry, the
Yes.
surgeons. And he said, well, what would you do? And the woman finally said, I would let him go, you know. And even when I watch that, I'm just thinking about it and talking about it now. It's very emotional to think what that must have been like for them,
It's,
to go out and sit in on the base on a park bench and
yeah.
basically make the decision of ending their son's life, you know.
Yes.
And they ultimately made that decision. Um, the beautiful thing about Jason being in that room in that hospital was, and Dan told me this, 24/7 there was always a Marine by his side,
Of
and
course.
that was unbelievable hearing that. He was never alone. There was always a Marine there. And that just going back to, Marines are special. That that is goddamn special, you
Truly
know.
is. It truly is. But that is a
Yeah,
Marine, and that is how the Marines look at one another. I want
yeah,
to tell you something, Dave. My brother, to this day, once a year, he lives outside of the United States. And once a year, he flies to Florida and he regroups with the remaining survivors that were with him in Quezon. And every
that's
year,
great.
every year, another one or two isn't there. They're all in their mid 70s and getting older
Yep.
now. But nonetheless, that's a Marine. They just carry that
Yeah,
all their life. So I totally relate to the honor, if you will, of standing there in the presence of a Marine and protecting him. And that's what they were doing, Dave, when
right.
they were in that hospital room. They were protecting his honor, his dignity, who he was,
Yeah,
and what he stood for to them, to each of them. And like I said, I wept multiple times when I watched The Gift. It was absolutely probably the strongest impacted sizzle reel I have ever seen in my life. I mean, I really encourage this audience to see it, Dave. I mean, you were involved in
yeah,
it. You understand.
yeah. And
I mean,
I think there's a reason why too, and I'll get to that in a minute.
yes,
You know, so this Marine is standing, by Jason's bed the whole time, and they make their decision. And the commandant of the Marine Corps happened to be at Bethesda that day, visiting wounded Marines, and he had
yes.
heard about Jason's situation and the parents making the decision. So he asked Deb, "Would it be okay if I stay?" And the commandant of the Marine Corps stayed in the room with the parents when they turned off life support. And
Wow.
I thought that was pretty special that he took the time to, you know, to do
That
that. And
that's
that's
very
special.
special.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, and Dan, still remembers the time he died at 4:43. And, he said before that, you could just see the tension in Jason's face. He was in pain,
Yes.
and he said when he died, he smiled and
Wow.
Dan knew he was at peace, you know?
That's amazing.
So, yeah.
It's
So, you know, so that's what happened. And they had to tell his siblings and all that and the funeral. And, they offered to have him buried at Bethesda, but they wanted him home, so he's
yes.
buried in the small town of Scio. Um, so, and I had no idea about these things until Deb called me, and then I became really close with them. And then, you know, all his Marines started to come back in September. They still had, this is April. They still had to keep, fighting until September. So they all returned. And I was there at 2 a.m. when the buses rolled through the gates at 29 Palms. And I met
Wow.
Mark Dean for the first time right off the bus. And from that point forward, and I wasn't even thinking about a documentary. It was just, I wanted a connection to some of these guys. And I wanted to share what I experienced with Jason. I wanted to be in the company of these kids and let them know that, Jason was a great kid. So I became really close with them. I used to bring them down to my house. We'd have cookouts. And you know, then I started to learn what happened. And but before all that happened, another buddy of mine who I grew up with, he was a Marine Corps officer, a Cobra pilot, and I had told him the story. And he called me one day. He said, "Did you see today's Wall Street Journal?" And I'm like, "No, why?" He's like, "Do you know what that kid did?" And I'm like, "No." He's like, "Go get the paper." And I went out and
Wow.
got the paper, and on the front page it was, the gift of valor. And Michael Phillips wrote this article, and I sat there and read it. And I'm like, "Oh my God, he
Yeah.
jumped on a grenade."
Yeah.
So then when I started meeting his Marines, they started telling me like a firsthand account of what happened. And a lot of the Quezon guys started telling me, "You need to tell his story.
Yeah.
This story needs to be told." And so months later, I actually sat 5 of these Marines down at my house and did, some short interviews. And man, it was tough. You know, it's one thing when you're interviewing some Marines who are at Quezon 30 plus years before
Yes.
and interviewing Marines now who had just gone through this thing months before. It was raw, it was emotional, and it was hard for me because by now I had become friends with these kids. They were like my
Yeah.
little brothers,
Yes.
and I hated asking them the questions. So I kind of just stopped and just put it on the shelf and said, I'll get back to that one day. So for years, I didn't do anything with it, but I'm still friends with these guys. I helped start the Jason Dunham Scholarship Foundation, which, we still need to work on. I want to change it to just a foundation and not a scholarship. But um, so I stayed in contact with, and all these guys were going on deployments after that. By now they're my friends.
Yes.
This kid
Of
Gerga's
course.
leaving his car at my house during the deployment, and they're in Ramadi on the second deployment, and this is 2005, and Ramadi was hot. It was blowing up, and I'm constantly watching the news, to see what's going on. Are these guys okay? And I'm on that website, look, KIAs, anybody, everybody, anytime there was an attack in Ramadi, a battle in Ramadi, I'm like, oh my God. I get a phone call one day, and it's Gerga, this kid, he's a Polish kid from Chicago, born in Poland, joined the Marine Corps. And I'm like, "Dude, where are you?" And I could hear the mortar rounds going out in the
Wow.
background. He's like, I'm in the Gov Center in Ramadi. And I'm like, "Are you okay?" And he's like, "Yeah, how's my car? My car good?" And I'm like, "Never mind the car, man. What are those explosions, And he's laughing, because these guys are getting mortared every day, rockets, small arms fire. And they're
That's
not going to,
hilarious in a twisted sort of way. It really is.
right. But if you go through that every day, that's your norm, right? It's
Yes,
like, yeah, we got some
exactly.
incoming. Nobody got killed. Cool. It just becomes a norm. And it's, people don't realize that, unless you're in the military, like I wasn't in war, but, my norm would be dealing with, rough seas. It's like, whatever, we
Yeah.
got waves coming over the bow. Who cares? We'll be fine. It just
Yeah.
becomes your norm. So yeah, these guys, went on multiple deployments. And then some of them started to get out. You know, Mark Dean was going to go back to Oklahoma and go to school, and he put in his package for the MECEP program, which is, a program the Marine Corps offers sergeants and above the ability to go to school and become an officer. So he wanted to become an officer and, try and be a pilot. So he went back to Oklahoma. Some of the other guys stayed in, went to Afghanistan on deployments. And they're gaining rank as they do this. Some of these guys are now staff sergeants, and then finally all of them kind of. Well, actually, there's a few who are still in. There's one of Jason's guys is I think he's a warrant officer now. He's still in the Marine Corps, but he's close to retiring. But I'm still in contact with a lot of them. And one thing that stuck out to me when I interviewed the Quezon guys was I always said to myself, especially when I interviewed the Iraq guys, when is the day going to come when this
Yeah.
stuff is going to start coming out for them? Because I'd already experienced with that with Quezon guys, because they told me, you know, it you know, Bob Arata in particular, who was on Hill 881, served under Captain Dabney, who was Chesty Puller's son-in-law, you know, and he told me, he said, the things I went through at Quezon affect me more now than they did the day it happened.
Yeah.
So I always thought to myself, when is that day going to come for these guys? Because I
And
knew
it
it
will
would come,
come. It will
and
come,
it
Dave.
did, and it did. So I was there. I tell people, I saw the good, I saw the bad, and I saw the ugly over the last 20 years. I'm talking about drug addiction, homelessness, suicide, divorce, you name it. Anything a combat veteran with post-traumatic stress or TBI goes through, I've seen it, and it breaks my heart because I love these
Well,
kids, you
well,
know.
Dave, I'm in my 19th year of working with homeless veterans out here on the streets. I don't know if you know this about me or not, but I'm a certified hospice chaplain, 24 years ordained. I've got a doctorate in pastoral counseling, and I've never made a dime off of it, nor have I wanted to make a dime off of it. I've always devoted my conversion. When we get off air, I'll share a few minutes with you and
Yeah, for sure.
about some of this story here. But I've got 2 movie producers working on my life story right now, so
Oh,
it'll
that's
be
great.
interesting for sure. But getting back to the heroics of these people, both Pete and I have worked outside of the wire. Both Pete and I have faced multiple near-death experiences in the service
Mm,
of our country, and it's so funny what goes through your mind in the moment. I've been captured. I was captured and tortured for a period of time. I was once kidnapped in Culiacan, Sinaloa, uh, facing death every second that I was in
yeah,
captivity until I was rescued. So, as you describe all of this and the emotions that you are impacted by having the time with people that have been on the front line, and you talking about it becoming the norm, the normal way of life, I fully relate to that, as does
yeah,
Pete Turner. We know that feeling and how strange it is, and how you can't talk to anybody when you come out of the field of
right,
battle or the situation you just did, other than other people that are like yourselves that have gone through what we would call and describe as the norm. It's pretty
right,
amazing. And getting back to the gift, the creation of the gift, the beyond powerful impact that carries with anyone that has ever been in the service of country, the near death experiences that we all encounter, how it becomes a norm, but we all are PTSD sufferers as a result
yeah,
of carrying those visions in our minds. And when that
right,
was created, looking at the children, looking at the family, looking at the everybody around as the roll call was done there at the cemetery, I mean, it was so beautifully created and conveyed. And I tell you, that was the greatest message to send to that heroic Medal of Honor recipient and to his family and to his friends. And David, to you, uh, what a prestigious way to be. I remember George Bush, President Bush, discussing him on TV one time. I think
yeah,
it was when he was awarded the Medal of Honor, if I remember. It's been a long time ago, but
yeah,
I uh, I actually remember that incident. And when I was watching the gift and I saw President Bush pop up on that little clip of the reel that you put him in there, I sat there and I smiled, thinking, well, I was honored to remember that his presence was recognized in such a great way. And
yeah. I shot that side view of Bush. I
oh,
was in
did
the
you
White
really?
House
Oh,
for that. Yeah, I was there for that.
yeah,
And I think when you're going through something like that, you don't even think it. Like, I look back on it and I was like, damn, I was in that room with Bush. I filmed
yeah.
that. You don't think
Well,
about it.
yeah, but
I really
Dave, look,
want him to see it. I really want Bush to see it, and I'm
yeah.
still working on getting that to him.
I think you would be honored to get that. I really do, because
Yeah.
kudos for Bush and the recognition he gave. And if you listen to his voice when he was describing what that Marine had endured and which ultimately took his life, I mean, you could feel that he was impacted. It wasn't fake. President Bush
Yeah,
really,
he's an emotional guy, and the Dunhams have told me they met with him at that time. It was 3 or 4 times they met with him, and
sure.
Secret Service. he went up to SIO. Secret Service was kind of in the
Wow.
room, and he finally said to them, he's like, "You guys need to stay outside and give us a minute." He
Wow.
basically told them, "You guys back off. This is a private moment with the family." And Dan and Deb have both told me how emotional he's an emotional guy, and you could
Yeah.
tell he really cared. I mean, he's painting pictures of the fallen now, right? He's a
Yeah.
painter,
Yeah, he is.
and I
I
hear
agree.
he's painting pictures of I mean, that must weigh on him too as a leader. It's like, I sent these kids
Yeah.
to war. You know,
Well, I
that's a
remember
burden he
watching it on the
carries.
news. I remember watching him on the news that day, and
Yeah.
I do remember how I could feel his emotion when he was talking about it. And I was thinking to myself, he's for real with this. He really means what he's saying. He's carrying this within
Hmm.
himself. And you were there. You were
Yeah.
there. It's
Yep.
amazing, Dave.
Yeah. It was an emotional day. That whole weekend was pretty emotional. Um, But like I said, I think the genuineness in these interviews and the rawness of these interviews that I did with these Marines really shows through, because when I decided to do this in 2019, I finally made the decision, like, hey, I'm gonna tell the story. It's time. And I called
Yeah.
Trent and told him. He
Yeah.
said, call Deb and Dan. So I called Deb and Dan, and I'd been in touch with them. But I said, listen, I want to run something by you. I said, for 17, 18 years, I told you I was going to do a documentary on your son, and I never finished it.
Yes.
And every year, even till this day, I don't call them on April 14th, the day it happened. I always call them the day after, because I just can't bring myself to do it.
I
So I
understand.
told them, I said, every April on the anniversary of this, I look at those hard drives where I have all the footage I already shot years before, and I keep telling myself I need to do this. And I told them, this is what I want to do. I said, I want to tell your son's story, but I want his Marines to tell it. And
Yeah.
that's exactly what because they've been approached by people,
Yeah.
with movie offers and all that stuff. So they said, we want you to do it because we trust you and we know why
Yes.
you're doing it.
Yes.
And that it was the same thing with the Marines, because these guys were now my friends after all these years. I still talk to them, all the time. And not about Iraq, but just, hey, what are you guys up to? You
Yeah.
want to come
You're in
out
a
here
relationship
fishing?
now.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Exactly.
So when I finally sat down and hit the road in 2020 in the middle of COVID to go to each one of their houses, it was it was unexpected how much they opened up to me. But especially um, Jason Sanders, who has always had a rough time with this. He's in Oklahoma. And we sat down and he just looked at me. He said, you ready? I said, yeah. He's like, good,
Yeah.
because I'm going to give you everything because I
Wow.
trust you.
Yeah.
And I've always carried that with me from the beginning of this, where I will not betray that trust. I've had meetings with, a production company in Beverly Hills who are like, yeah, I'll get you the money for the doc, but I'm interested in a scripted series like, Generation Kill. And, my uncle was a Marine. I understand. And I'm like, I just listen, and I'm, courteous about it.
Or
But I left that meeting and I looked at my producer. I said, he's not the guy. I said,
yeah.
we're not. And he's like, what do you mean? It sounds like, and I'm like, no, man. He's like, but he's going to give us money. I said, I don't care. I said, I'm not doing this for money.
I love that.
I'm doing this out of respect. I said,
Absolutely.
I'm not taking his money. That guy has no idea what these kids went through, and he's like, well, I said, I'm the guy who's got to look at the Dunhams and these Marines and tell them why it's all fucked up because
And
we
they
took money from
trusted
some
you.
guy.
They
Right.
trusted you.
Right. And I was not going to, betray. And I had another similar meeting with Peter Berg's production company, Film 45, and they loved the idea too. And, I love Pete Berg and I respect him because of what he did with Marcus Luttrell. But
Yeah, that was
in the back of
fantastic.
my mind, I'm like, I hope they say no. I didn't want them to say yes. And they passed. And I was like, oh, good. And my buddy's like, well, where are you going to get the money? I said, I don't know. We'll find it. And then on Christmas, I get this email from a Marine, Anthony Taylor, who said, I want to pay for this. And I was like, what? And, you know, we were off to the races after that. So yeah, getting back to, interviewing these guys, the raw emotion was there. And I'll tell you, somebody asked me in one of these screenings at a film festival, what was the hardest part of this project? And, most people would say, logistics, traveling across the country, camera gear, finding the money. I said, the hardest part for me was doing the interviews, not the actual, interview, but it's just the amount of strength it took out of me at the end of every interview was unbelievable. It was like, you know, I got to Maine, and that's where Trent Gibson had lived at the time. He had a cabin in the woods in Lubec, Maine, which is on the border of Canada, most eastern town in the United States.
Huh, interesting.
And beautiful place, right? It's right on the water in the woods. Loved it there. I would move there in a heartbeat. And I'm sitting out by the campfire he's got outside this cabin, and I'm having a beer. He comes out and sits down. I'm just staring at the fire, and he's like, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah, I'm okay." I said, "It's been 2 months. You're my 10th interview and my last interview." I said, "I'm just thinking about tomorrow morning when I have to peel back that scab again,
Yeah.
and how hard it is for me to do that. Because every time I do that, all this trauma comes out,
Yes.
and I'm processing it too. I'm hearing the intricate little details of what happened that day. And when I had a rough cut done, I called Deb. I'm up in Salt Lake City now. I left LA, but I was driving down there to see my kids. So I called Deb and Dan. I said, "Hey, I got a cut done." And she said, "Well, what do you think?" And I started crying, you
Yeah.
know, because I told her, I said, "I've spent the last 3 months reliving that day second by second with
Yes.
every one of these Marines we interviewed. And, working on that in the dark of winter in the mountains in Salt Lake took a toll. It really, I would send, we were on a group text with all these Marines, and just out at 2 in the morning, I'd be like, "I love you guys," and
Yes.
they're like, "You all right?" I'm like, "Yeah, man, I'm just in it right now with this stuff." And it's because I'd be editing and I'd listen to somebody say something and I'd be like, "Man," I'd have to sit back and digest that.
But Dave, they know you love them. They know it, and
Oh
what
yeah, and that's why the interviews look real, and it's not some producer showing up from
no,
some production company like, "Okay, I'm here to do the interview. So tell me about what you went through in Iraq."
yeah,
It's like, "Hey man, I know what you went through.
yeah,
You and I have already talked about this, at 2 in the morning on the phone when you called me because you were thinking about ending your life. I know, because I've had a lot of those calls over the,
yes,
years about, somebody being out in the middle of nowhere alone. I'm like, "What are you doing?" I said, "You got a gun with you?" "Yeah." I'm like, "What's wrong with you, man? You can't, you got kids. And that's a lot to deal with,
I got a
when
call
you
like
care
that.
about someone.
I got a call like that 2 years ago from a friend of mine. I call him Captain Robert, who called me up to say goodbye and took his life right after he hung up the phone. So I totally get it. Both of us had been
Yeah.
captured and put in war. Well, both of us had been tortured. Both of us expected death at any moment for week after week, month after month. We went through that, and we only had each other to share it with. And in 2003, I'll share this with you, Dave, because of the honor you've showed those men. There were 7 of us at the Seattle VA hospital that were recognized for being captured and tortured on foreign soil in service of our country. Today, I am the last man standing out of the 7 of us. Over
Wow.
the over the last 21 years, through natural causes, through suicide, whatever, they've all gone now. And I no longer have Captain Robert to talk to when I'm dealing with my
Right.
nightmares at the jungle in the middle of the night. And it is so infallible. 8 months ago, I almost committed suicide because of the
Wow.
memories. Yeah, it's deep. And both Pete and I are PTSD. We're
Yeah.
PTSD patients with the VA and have been for a number of years. So the reason I bring that into focus right now for the audience and for you specifically, David, is when you're talking about it and I hear the constraint in your voice and I recognize that emotional moment of that flash memory. Brother, those things are never going to leave us. They're never going to go away.
Yeah.
But what we have to do is pull them out, take a look at them, make peace with it in the moment, and then put it back inside because you know it's never going to go away. So I have nothing but respect for you and what you did for these Marines, what you did for their families, what you did for a stranger like me who 2 days ago watched that and literally broke down and wept repeatedly throughout it. It was it was a cleansing, Dave. It was a cleansing. It was a purification of things that only those of us that have looked at death in that face and that type of a caliber can truly understand. And I want you to know, Dave, that you helped this veteran in the creation of that documentary. And I will never forget you for it, ever.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad that it did some, it's funny you say that because that was one of the things I wanted to do by doing this film was hopefully it would help, especially Mark Dean's story. His storyline has been taken out of the version we're releasing because we have a 5-part series, and I want to try and get that out there because it goes deeper, into Mark's story, into the wives' stories. But early on, that was I wanted this to help other guys, especially when they see Mark's story about, Mark was homeless at one point. It started with, painkillers from the VA, 2000, mid 2000s, right? They're just handing out oxy to everybody. He gets addicted to it. They try and cut him off. He goes to the street. He's buying pills in the street, feeding his addiction. And then that turns to somebody turning him onto meth. And then he goes on a 4-year meth run, dies of a heroin fentanyl overdose, brings him back to life. He checks himself out of the hospital, goes back to the street, keeps doing drugs. And even during filming, I'm in Oklahoma, I'm in Tulsa, and I'm on the phone with him. And I'm like, I want to sit you down. I said, I know you're still screwed up, man, but, I still want to sit you down. People need to know your story. And I sat in this park with my crew, and he never came, and I knew where he went.
Yeah.
And then months later, his ex-wife called me and said, hey, Mark was arrested and he's actually been clean for 6 months, And I had heard this before. I had already gone through it. I got him into 2 rehabs, which he bailed on. And, one of the Quezon guys finally told me, he said, he's not going to do it until he wants to do it. And this is coming from a Quezon guy who,
so true,
had a heroin addiction in the 70s. He said, he's got to hit rock bottom. And he did. He hit rock bottom, and he was sitting in that jail cell, and he thought to himself, he said, I spoke to God for the first time in a long time because everything I had was gone. I lost everything. And God told me if I just listened to him, I get my family back, I'll have my life back. And that was his journey of starting to become sober. That was 4 years ago, and he's still clean. And he wrote a book.
Beautiful? That's beautiful.
Yeah. He wrote a book called Miracles on a Rooftop. Yeah.
We can talk about that a lot someday, Dave. I've been working with homeless vets for 19 years out here, totally strung out, totally caught up in the memories that they can't erase. I love that you have had direction in that regard. I'm very familiar.
You should bring him on the show. You should bring Mark on the show.
I think we need to talk about that when we get off air. I think I would like to do that because that's exactly what the Crisis Victory Show is about. People who have gone through extreme crisis events, and we come out on the other side on a humanitarian scale. And well, as we get ready to wrap up here, David, I'd like to personally thank you and give tribute to what you created. And I hope you do take it to heart when I tell you how impacted that was to me 2 days ago and how that helped me when I deal as a full-blown PTSD patient based on captivity and torture. And you created something very special there, Dave. And
thank you.
I send love to you and nothing but respect to you. And I look forward to seeing the season creations. I'm very excited about what you've done there. I'd like to say, with David's respect also, I want to thank you, Jason, for your sacrifice. I want to thank you for your service. And may you be resting with the angels and your fellow soldiers in heaven above. We love you, we respect you, we honor you, and we're here for your family and all of the veterans that are left behind that preserve your memory. And thank you, David, for creating such a powerful documentary. It does help some of us veterans that are struggling. Thank you, Dave. God bless you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, folks. Well, that wraps up another episode today. And I'd like to take this moment to thank each and every one of you for taking your time to catch our show. Now, if you like these shows, I would ask that you would please hit like, share, and subscribe. It's so important to us that we get these messages out, and we understand that these are graphic, almost toxic interviews. But, this is the kind of impact that we feel is needed in order to make sure that people understand the significance of the problems that we are confronted within our own country and around the globe. So I'm going to say at this time that I love you all. God bless you all. Hasta luego, y vaya con Dios, and go Victors.